Hey everyone, welcome to another Ask GN. It's been a little while for these. So this is a community questions and answers segment. You can leave your questions in the comment section below. We also have some from our Patreon backers on Discord, and there will also be a second Ask GN going to the public channel. So we're doing 2 of these for public release over the next day or so. And then there's a Patrons is the word I was looking for. Patrons Ask GN that will be available via Discord or the Patreon group for anyone who wants to watch that separate episode with just some extra fun questions from Discord. So getting into this one, I should also note the second public Ask GN one we're doing will hopefully feature Snowflake, I think. So check back for that. I'm going to try and film the intro at the home studio for that. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Master motherboard, which comes equipped with one of the more powerful Z390 VRMs for heavier overclocks on the new 9th gen Intel CPUs. The Aorus Master is also one of the few motherboards with a real heatsink this generation, featuring a mix of high surface area fins and looks-oriented cover blocks. Oh, and it's also got updated RGB illumination. Learn more at the link below. All right, so as always, the format for these, we're going into, 105th episode, something like that. So format for these is leave your questions below, and I'll do my best to get to them, and I might have to pitch them to people who know more than I do, depending on how hard they are. So also, I'll just note these are still sort of in stock, so if you want one, they're on store.camersnexus.net. But all right, first question is from Ultimate Fate, who said, why are the GT 1030, GTX 1050, and 1050 Ti manufactured using a 14 nanometer processor versus the 16 nanometer FinFET process used for the rest of the Pascal cards? How did Nvidia have lower end cards manufactured using the smaller process, and why were the other cards not manufactured using the smaller node? So the process size doesn't, smaller process size or process node doesn't just mean it's better, as a first note. Nvidia does not give a great answer on this question if you ask. Officially, their response is something to the tune of, we believe all of our manufacturing partners are great, and all of these process nodes are excellent choices for our GPUs and our gamers. So not particularly helpful. My understanding is that the switch between different solutions providers for silicon manufacturing by Nvidia, TSMC or otherwise, is really just to spread the load. So that's kind of how I understand it. Is it's a means of ensuring that there's a constant supply of GPUs and that they're not putting too much strain on one source. And it also allows to, in theory, provide some additional negotiation leverage when negotiating prices for the silicon parts that come out of the fabs, because Nvidia is fabless. So that's my understanding. As for technical differences, I mean, it's just, I don't think there are any meaningful differences in a way that you would see them manifest in performance or in the capabilities of the cards. At least that's how I was told when I asked this question to a few people in the industry. So yeah, my understanding is really just it's to spread the manufacturing load and to get multiple sources, just like they do for memory. They get Hynix, Micron, Samsung memory, whatever they can get to put on the cards, and sometimes some is a bit better than others, but it all fits the spec. So, but back to the question of node sizes, I'll just note that things like density do matter as well. The definition matters. So AMD, for an easy example, AMD's 7 nanometer is similar to Intel's 10 nanometer in actuality, and well, assuming Intel ever makes it. But it comes down to, again, density, definition, who's making it, what is their technology. So not necessarily as simple as like you got 14 nanometer over here and 16 over here. 14 is better than 16. Next question. We're gonna have a couple of hard cuts on this one because I'm still kind of sick. So next one is from Darr, who says, new motherboards often come with one or more thermocouples. Thermocouples. Which motherboard component or installed device would you choose to monitor? Great question. So yes, some of the high-end ASUS boards do come with thermocouples. I don't think too many boards come with them, but certainly the high-end overclocking ones do. The problem is that typically those thermocouples are like the fatter kind. So you can get kind of two types of thermocouples. You get the flat film kind, which is really good. They're expensive as heck to buy, but they're very good. You can sandwich them between just about anything. It doesn't really impact thermal performance. Your measurements will be accurate down to fractions of a degree, and the resolution is often like 0.1 degrees Celsius or something like that. So those are really good, and that's what we use for example, if you want to sandwich them between small SMDs and a pad or something. But the problem is the ones that come with the motherboards have their, I can't remember exactly, they have like a bulb end, so it's a bit thicker and round. So you can use them for sure to some degree of accuracy, but the problem is you can't really like sandwich it between a MOSFET and a pad, because the end of the thermocouple where the measurement is actually taken is not touching the MOSFET directly in that scenario. It's probably sort of floating up in the pad or in the air with the bottom side of it touching the MOSFET. So you're not going to get the most accurate reading that way, which is unfortunate, but also it is now creating a height gap between the device and its heatsink, which could pose issues with mounting. You could crush the thermocouple when you tighten the heatsink, or you might not tighten it enough and there's not good thermal contact. The results are meaningless, stuff like that. So if you get a board with a flat thermocouple, properly flat, like what are they, like 1/100th of an inch thick typically for the good ones, then I would put it on a hotspot MOSFET, which you can determine by kind of, I mean, ideally you measure them, but for all intents and purposes, for consumer use, it's about the same to just kind of look at it and then, you know, count the MOSFETs and pick the one in the middle, assuming they're all V-core. And if it's not V-core and there's one that's like GT over on the end, then ignore that one. So yeah, that's how I would do it. I would pick a hotspot, like central MOSFET that's sandwiched between some inductors, because those are really hot, and some capacitors, and maybe isn't poor airflow, and I'd stick a thermocouple on there. But if they are the sort of bulbous thermocouples, which they often are, then I guess my choice would be, if I'm doing an open loop, maybe I'd stick one in the reservoir just to get a liquid temperature. That's really useful, kind of interesting to look at. So that's a good choice for you. You could you could shove one between, maybe if it's tight enough, in between a MOSFET and an inductor, as opposed to on top of one of them, because then you're not going to cause a height gap issue. And you can just kind of get an ad hoc measurement of between two really hot things and make sure they're not crazy. Now, does it tell you anything useful? Sort of. But I mean, you'll know if they're too hot, and up until that point, it's maybe not the most useful measurement, but could be fun to look at. Other places you could stick one. I mean, if you think there's if you have concerns of, I don't know, heat with your GPUs, maybe you have multiple GPUs are sandwiched together, maybe you have an M.2 SSD under there or something like that. For the most part, you can look at software measurements for all of these devices. But if not, for some reason, then I would consider a thermocouple down between the GPUs, or maybe under where the SSD is, because that's going to be a really hot area that's sandwiched between a bunch of things. And one more option here that's actually pretty practical is just a case ambient thermocouple. You just kind of, it won't be great for cable management, but just kind of tie it somewhere like on a hard drive cage, or somewhere that's between the CPU intake fan and the front of the case, or if there's a water block, then the water block in the front of the case, between your intake and where the air is supposed to go, basically. Consider just mounting one kind of in the case, floating in air, and that'll give you an ambient temperature in the case. So if you know your external ambient is 21 degrees and you see your case is 40, well, there's plenty of room to improve your case airflow. So that's another a really good and practical place to put one. Hopefully those give you some ideas. They're not all that helpful for everyday use, but they're definitely fun to use. Thermocouples, it gives you some more measurements you don't normally get. Otherwise, these are typically for high-end overclocking scenarios. They can be used to insert into the through hole in the socket. Sometimes there's one of those in high-end boards, so you can get a socket temperature. I would say you could use them for like a dry ice pot or LN2 pot or something like that, but you probably want to use something better for that, better insulated, better built. Hopefully those give you ideas though. Great question. If you have any more like that, please ask them. Lots of fun to work with those types of questions. Next one, human person says, yes, I'm sure you are not a robot or an alien at all. Human person, what PSU wattage is reasonable? Do I just add the TDP of all my components and then take double or something like that? Really good question. This is a pretty sort of basic one, but also one that's important to answer and is I'm not particularly well documented. So power supply wattage, what's reasonable? I wouldn't just add the TDP. So I wouldn't take like my GPU is 250, my CPU is 90. I wouldn't then call that 340 for the for the power supply requirement at that point. I would here's what I would do. I would go to reviews and look up like the actual power consumption tests. These are kind of tricky. I'll tell you why in a moment, but look at power consumption tests between hopefully us. We might have some. Anantech normally does a good job of them. PCPer in the past has done a good job of them. And there's plenty others out there too. So I would check different reviews for the power consumption of the components you're using. Now, here's the trap you need to avoid. A lot of the time, we reviewers will use total system power consumption for our benchmarks. And what you're really looking at is kind of a delta there. So if device A consumes, big air quotes around that, 500 watts on this chart, imaginary chart, and device B consumes 600 watts, ultimately the difference is 100 watts. And assuming the test platform itself is controlled properly, and I know we control ours properly, and I'm sure other reviewers do theirs as well, then that's a reliable means to determine the difference relative of the two devices. So you're really looking at a relative difference, not necessarily an absolute difference, because unless you know exactly the power consumption of the rest of the system, then you've got kind of a variable there. And the reason that measure is taken is because for things like GPUs, it's strictly speaking, it's easier, and it is. I mean, that's really mostly it. Because you can current clamp the power cables going to the GPU. That's not difficult at all. But to then also get the power going through the socket, that's kind of hard because ideally you do something like a riser cable and then you splice off the 12-volt lines, maybe make them a bit longer and clamp those. But that is also kind of difficult to do properly. I've spoken with BuildZoid about this in the past. We have some solutions, but there are ways to do it. Absolutely. Alan Malventano, when he was at PCPer, he would do this type of thing to just get only the GPU power draw in a GPU power consumption test by clamping the right things, by going through a riser, measuring that with, I don't know if it was an external controller or a clamp, but there are ways to do that. It's just that typically you see total system power consumption. So if you see 500 watts, check to see what the chart is for. If it says total system power consumption, that's not the power consumption of the video card or the CPU or whatever you're looking up. It's everything, and it's under some kind of load. Remember that power fluctuates based on load. So I would account for my expected maximum usage scenario, which is probably going to be at some point 100% usage, and then I would look up the power consumption of different devices. And if I can find an individual test, for example, our CPU tests are not total system power consumption. They are CPU-only power consumption before VRM efficiency losses are taken into account, but close enough. So for our test for CPUs, you'll see an accurate number to what's going to be drawn. And then once you figure out your power supply needs, your wattage needs, add a bit to that. So maybe 20% to 50% overhead, just depending on how much efficiency you want. At 50%, you're going to be at peak efficiency of the power supply, but you don't need that much. You could be at 20% or something if you want to save some money. So figure out the wattage just by adding things together from reviews, and then add some overhead on top of that. So, I mean, that's the way to do it, honestly, is to look at reviews. I'm, of course, biased in this. We do reviews, but that's what I would do. So that's what I would suggest you would do. Because TDP is it's a tricky number. Everyone's got a different definition of it. For CPUs, it's more a measure of how much cooling potential is needed to keep the CPU at spec or under TJ max. Now, typically TDP, at least, well, in general, is pretty close to the actual power consumption, but not always, as we've illustrated. Depends on things like MCE. And then GPUs, you also have board power versus GPU power. So depending on how the manufacturer rates their TDP, that may or may not account for memory power consumption, which is somewhat significant as well. So anyway, that's what I would do. Hopefully that helps a bit. Next one. Eric Ernst. A month ago, I noticed when you overclock processors that temperatures of each core vary, sometimes by a lot. I also noticed that on the 7980XE, you raised the multiplier by 1x more on the first 2 cores and then the rest of the cores, could you optimize your overclock by raising the multiplier on cooler cores and lowering it on the hotter cores to equalize the temperatures across the entire package? Would that stabilize the package for more total frequency, or is a straight overclock a better option? So let me try to jump to the answer on this. Yes, so technically different cores will overclock better than others. It's typically a pretty small difference. So for competitive overclocking, when we're fighting with anyone on the leaderboards, then it is worth it, because it's a lot of the times a great way to gain an extra, maybe even a couple hundred points on times by extreme, which is significant when you're at the edge anyway, to try and regain a lead. So it's worth it there. I don't know that I would say it's worth it for my home system, because it's a lot of work. And ultimately, unless you're competitively overclocking, you're not really gaining that much for real performance. A couple FPS, maybe, and probably not even that. So I would not say it's worth it. But to answer your question, yes, core-to-core overclocking is technically the way to get the most out of the CPU, because I don't want to use really the word binning, but each core will perform differently, and that can be for a few different reasons. It can be for silicon quality. It can be for where is the core on the package. If it's in a cooler area, then it might be able to run a bit higher frequency because it's cooler. So it's not fighting the same thermal challenges that a hotter core maybe in the center of all the other hot cores would be fighting, giving you some extra thermal headroom to push the frequency a bit higher. So anyway, could you optimize across the entire package? The answer is yes. And in an ideal world, if you have infinite time, then you sit there and you tune each of the, in our case, 18 cores for that scenario, and you find which ones can do 5.1, which one can maybe do 5.2, and you set the others to 49 and 50, something like that. So yeah, I hopefully that answers your question. It's the answer is yes, you could optimize your overclock, but the answer to is it worth it is no, almost certainly not, except for competitive overclocking. So next one. This one is from Lamont, who said, "Hi Steve, thanks for the informative content you produce. Been enjoying it since I stumbled into it researching my new builds. What are the most basic benchmarking tools, or the more basic, and validation tests you'd recommend for someone who wants to validate system performance with an emphasis on gaming, and maybe simple pre and post overclock performance CPU primarily? I don't want to become a benchmark junkie or run hours of tests, but I'd like to know if I've got any problems where my hardware is underperforming. For example, I'd like to determine if my CPU or GPU are being thermally throttled and see what impact it has if I open the front case door for more air intake when gaming, or modify fan curves or locations. I'm looking for the high school yearbook greatest result, least effort winners here." Excellent way to phrase that question, and I can help out with that. So I think the first thing I would point out, let's do your thermal question first. That's really easy. Is it throttling? So the answer is you can use Hardware Info 64. It's free. It's really good. We like it. I would love to speak with a developer one day, but we don't know anything about them other than they make really good software. So Hardware Info 64 is the one I use. GPU-Z is another one. You can get the data you need just from Hardware Info 64. It's a bit easier to use that for CPU and then use GPU-Z for GPU, because it's just too much. It's too much data with Hardware Info 64 to scroll back and forth. So I would recommend that, and use that for CPU. Is it throttling? Well, the cool thing is, even if you don't know TJ Maxx, you get four really obvious indicators if it is throttling. One of them is a straight list of thermal target, or thermal limit, it says. So it's a whole section that says like thermal limit, yes, no. And if it says no all the way down, then you're good. And if it says yes anywhere in the thermal limits for any individual core, then that core has hit the thermal limit. Maybe 105C on X299, 109 on one of those CPUs, 100-ish on the average Intel desktop CPU, and then depends for AMD. So that would be the first list to look at. This talking after a cold day, much harder than I remembered. The second thing to look for is also, it'll highlight red if the answer is yes, it's throttling. Second thing to look for is going to be the actual temperature area where you'll get core temperatures. And if those are hitting TJ max or too close to TJ with thermal junction max, then that is a problem, and you're going to be thermal throttling probably or very close to it. So TJ max, you can either look up for the CPU you're using, or you just kind of, I think it tells you in hardware info in one of the columns, you look at distance from TJ max. That'll tell you how many degrees Celsius you are away from the maximum junction temperature. That's the one you care about. And ideally you see something like 10 or more, and then you're probably pretty good at that point. As for other, well, there's other places you can see throttling in there too, like just looking at the frequency of the CPU and seeing, does it drop down? And if it does, then it's throttling. It's just a question of why. Is it throttling because you forgot to remove the current or power limitations? That's a pretty common one. Is it throttling because of thermals? Is it throttling because of a turbo duration limit, which would be stock Intel spec, for example? AMD has it too. So, and those answers you can get through the other column where it says like throttle reason, yes, no, and it's in words, not in numbers, in Hardware Info 64. With Intel, you could also use XTU, which will give you some additional yes-no readouts on throttles. I don't particularly like XTU, but sometimes if we're really puzzled, it can be the best way to get an answer just because Intel makes it. So it does detect accurately in almost all cases. But Hardware Info 64 is on average better than XTU at this point. So short version of the first part of the answer, Hardware Info 64. Second part, GPU-Z. For a GPU, it's harder to tell if it's throttling because it will completely modulate the clock all the time. It changes constantly. And what you're really looking for is a rough average, just do a mental average. And depending on the card, on average under 84 degrees Celsius, you're going to be running at boost specifications. But if you get it down to like 60, then it'll run maybe 25, 50 megahertz higher, something like that. Get it down below 60, down to 50, something like that, 40, it'll boost even higher. So is it throttling? Well, sort of, in that, yes, it is clock gating based on thermals, but it's not truly thermal throttling until you're beyond like 84 degrees on the average Nvidia GPU, or 87 on the new ones. And AMD's target varies. I think most of theirs are at around 80 something, 90, somewhere in there. So you'll start seeing thermal throttling pretty obviously in the frequency. You want to cross-validate with performance, you can use 3D Mark. It's free as well, at least the version you would need is free. You can use that, run the test a few times, or run it on loop, or pause the demo. You can do that by clicking, and then just look at the frequency over time in GPU-Z and see if it kind of does that and levels out. And you'll see that to some extent, but if you see it more than 35 megahertz, then you might be throttling, and you can fix that with fan placement. As for validating performance recommendations, 3D Mark's good. It's easy. You can compare results online pretty easily, so that makes it nice. You could use, for stability, I hesitate to recommend Prime at this point. Prime 95 is very easy. It's a free application. It's small. You could use Prime 95 26.6, specifically that version. For non-AVX testing, it'll be less thermally straining. We have custom settings we use, but for something easy, I'd recommend just clicking the small FFTs button and clicking go. And that'll tell you pretty quickly if you're stable under non-AVX workloads. That's really useful. That's going to be your average game as non-AVX. And it just generates a ton of heat, takes a ton of power. And if it survives that, the CPU survives that for an hour plus, then it's probably going to survive indefinitely. Maybe run it overnight if you're feeling adventurous or really want to be sure. And then the next option would be Prime 95 29 point whatever is current. 2, I think is what we've often used. There's newer ones. And that's an AVX workload. That's straining. And if you don't have a negative AVX offset, then it might not survive. Whether or not that matters to you depends on how much you use AVX workloads. If you use Blender, Blender's an AVX software, AVX accelerated, then you would want it to be stable in AVX workloads. But that's the most stressing. You might not have a CPU that survives that. Not like physically kill it, unless your settings are really bad. It won't physically kill the CPU. It just won't be stable, and you'll have to downclock or something. So those are the good options that I could get through without just making a whole video about this. So hopefully that gives you a starting point. Short version, Hardware Info 64, GPU-Z, Prime 95, 26.6 and 29 point something. small FFTs for that, and 3D Mark. And if you want FurMark for a power virus for the GPU, be careful with that one, and it's also not, it won't enumerate the clock in the same way you're used to seeing because it has some protections in it so it doesn't kill itself. So you won't see the same high clocks you're used to seeing, but it is a good stressor for like VRM thermals. Next one, Ethan L. When overclocking memory on a GPU, does it follow the same rules as standard system memory? As in, your system memory always reads half of its actual clock speed due to reading per channel, also based on DDR. Does GPU memory work the same way? The spec page for my EVGA 2080 Ti FTW3 shows 1400 megahertz, but when in precision, the clock shows at 7000 megahertz. So by that math, when increasing the memory clock by, say, 350, is it functionally increasing it by 700? Is that in fact the case? Great question. So let me break this down for you. If what you're talking about effective clock and actual clock is what you're talking about for GPUs. So an example, actual clock, you might see 1750 megahertz. Effective clock, you'll see it advertised as 7000 or 7010 megahertz. So if you have a GDDR5 GPU that's rated as 7 gigabits per second, it's kind of the same as saying 7000 megahertz. It's interchangeable the way GPUs are rated. Then that is an actual clock of 1750. So the reason, it's easy math. 7,000 divided by x equals 1750, so it's 4. And this is because for every clock cycle, I can do it. For every clock cycle, GDDR5 can achieve 4 data transfers. And with DDR, you double. With GDDR, you double again, so you're just quadrupling. So you can think of it as a formula of base frequency or actual frequency, 1750, multiplied by the number of of pumps or of data transfers per clock. It gives you your effective clock. So 1750 would be 7,000, 1750 actual. Doesn't really matter which number you use, just be consistent and use the same one for everything, and it's fine. You'll also, as I said, often see gigabits per second and gigahertz used interchangeably in GPU memory, video memory. No rhyme or reason to it, just people switch between them. One's kind of a rate and one's a speed. So hopefully that helps a bit. Pretty simple. I think, did I answer every point of that question? I think I got most of what you asked. So yeah, I mean that's what it is, quadruple basically. Next one, Scooby Dooby asks, so Unreal Engine is owned by Epic Games. Yes, we're aware. They're just that way. They're up the street. Epic Games just launched a Steam competitor on PC that not only gives developers a bigger cut of the pie, but also incentivizes them to use Unreal Engine by waiving the fee for its use in games released exclusively on Epic Games Store. Unreal Engine heavily favors Nvidia architectures. Do you think this could be the beginning of a profound shift toward Nvidia? We're pretty familiar with the new store and with its incentives, so it's cool to see. It's good to see a competitor Steam that's got a good chance. Now, no is my answer though. I don't think this will change anything meaningfully. Unreal Engine's already used everywhere that it's not that's not a AAA game. So I think AAA games, you'll still see them using their own engines. You're still going to see Far Cry and Dunya. You're still going to see Sniper on like Asura or something. You're still going to, maybe not AAA, but they're not going to use someone else's engine. Theirs is like the best. You'll still see Ubisoft on whatever engine it is they use, I forget. You'll still see modified Crystal for Tomb Raider. So I don't think it will meaningfully really change that much. Unreal Engine is very appealing to mid-sized studios. It's getting used by some of the larger studios. Of course, we see it, Kingdom Hearts, I think, is getting or was remade with it. It's certainly big, and we use Unreal Engine for some stuff we do here. We greatly respect its abilities, but I don't think it's going to really change how widespread it is or introduce concerns to the GPU market just because Epic Games has a store now. I don't think so. I'm also not sure that it's always true, or well, to what degree it is true that Unreal Engine favors NVIDIA architectures. I know we've seen that, but I don't know. What does that mean? You have to get two cards that are directly comparable. So maybe an RX 580 and a 1060. you see the 1060 outperform the 580, or a 590 maybe a better example because it probably shouldn't on average, then yeah, I would say there's an engine benefit there. But I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's, I don't know. I'm not worried about this at all. So my answer is no. I don't think it changes anything. Next one, exeus. Am I correct in assuming that I will be able to put a Ryzen 3000 series CPU in the AM4 slot on an X370 motherboard? Obviously, there's no chance of a BIOS update for PCIe Gen 4 on that, but I'm curious as to whether X370 would, for example, handle the Ryzen 7 or 9 3000 chip when it's eventually released. My understanding is yes, you'll be able to use it in X370. Be mindful of VRM requirements, and because those may go up with a higher core count CPU, they will go up, and mindful of BIOS updates, but my understanding is yes, you would be able to do so. Last couple here, last two. Andrew says, when doing live streams, many of the astute overclockers among us give you helpful tips on which motherboard settings to tweak, like vMesh. Can you go through some of the more obscure but still important CPU overclocking settings and what they do? This was a hard question for me to think about. There are really obscure overclocking settings, and I scroll past them a lot. But that should tell you something. A lot of the time we don't use them. And I've spoken with BuildZoid about this, and with Rowan Derbauer, and with Stepanzi, and with Vince Kingpin. And there are absolutely settings they use that I don't use, but there are also settings that really no one uses. So I don't know how to address those because I can't even remember what they're called. But they're obscure to a point of being meaningless in 99% of use cases. So just as an example, BuildZoid, friend of the channel and does some work for us occasionally. BuildZoid in the past, when he was helping with some memory overclocking, I asked him, okay, so what do these ones do? And he could answer that almost every time, and he is extremely knowledgeable, really knows his stuff. But every now and then, I mean, there's a million tertiary memory timings. And every now and then I'd hit one where he'd say, honestly, I'm not sure, I make it as low as possible. And that's completely valid. That's all I needed to know, is should this number be big or small? I didn't need to know necessarily how it worked. Now, I would love to, but the point of me saying this is that BuildZoid, whom we consider to be one of the best overclockers out there, also does not know every single setting. There's a lot of them, and they aren't all important. So anyway, to give you a couple examples of some that I think are not obscure, but are probably reasonably obscure to a mainstream audience, or maybe some of you. So one of them, memory timings in general, very important for overclocking, for competitive overclocking, not often tapped into by most of the audience. I think most of the audience, thinking back to when I was kind of starting, it's kind of like set the core ratio and then look up what's a safe vCore and then set that. I think that's kind of how people mostly do it. So memory is really important. TFAW is a good one. So this is for active window, and it's the length, or it's a period of time wherein the row activations happen 4 times in one rank. That's an important one. The more you can drop it and maintain stability, your performance will improve a bit. TREFI, TREFC, I don't consider those obscure. We talk about them a lot. But if you're not familiar with them, or the average overclocker probably isn't, then maybe obscure is safe. Refresh cycle and refresh interval, you want those to be heavily modified as well. So if you're working with overclocking or competitive overclocking, the important things to remember is that you want the memory to retain its information for as long a period of time as possible, and to refresh it when it has to as quickly as possible. So that's what REFI interval and REFC will do. So you want, for example, a lower TRFC and a really high TREFI, like 32,000, 60,000, whatever the board will allow, for competitive overclocking. Not necessarily the best settings for everyday use, but that's a good one to know. DRAM current limits, maybe? Not that important, but you can current throttle on your memory. So you need to kind of max those out. IA current limits. vMesh is a good one you named. So mesh voltage, it's for Uncore on the X299 CPU is really important. Uncore would be basically mesh on something like the 7980XE, and that handles intra-chip communications. It handles the memory controller speed. It handles the cache. So stuff like that, I/O between the cores, that's really important, and that's mesh, and probably not too commonly messed with. I wouldn't consider it obscure, but I'm hoping I'm hitting a few here that some of you that don't know about. I/O and SA voltages, those are important. You really need to be careful about SoC for AMD. You need to be careful about how high you set those voltages. Those are the ones that can quickly degrade a chip, and you won't necessarily know that it's happening. Spread spectrum, basically disable it, is my approach to this one. Spread spectrum is supposed to reduce EMI, but it does so at potentially the cost of a bit higher frequency, cost of stability potentially. And then, I don't know, that's a pretty good list. That's about all I got right now. There are way more obscure ones. I apologize, I did not pull out boards and go digging through them, but I guess my goal for this was obscure ones that we still use, and they're not that obscure. But anyway, last one. Steamed, or ST33Med, said, are we going to see more of HypeBeast Steve? I sure hope not. I really hope not. And that's, well, the fact that I can barely talk right now, let's just run with that and end the show. So thank you for watching. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by picking up one of our mule mugs or mod mats. By the way, finally shipping to us, the mod mats. So we'll have them in about 10 days from now, I think. So they'll be going out soon. Or subscribe for more. Patreon episode will be up shortly, and a second one to the public channel, if not already. I can't talk anymore. So I'll see you all next time.